Good day, everybody, especially to you, Mom. So, as of now, Fertit and I will be summarizing our assigned topic in Chapter 20, the Commonwealth and the World War II. The Commonwealth in the World War II in 1935 to 1945. The Americans created a government in the Philippines that was democratic and republican in form, based after the United States. Filipinos began to govern themselves but not totally under this democratic administration. As a result, when the Pacific War broke out and the Japanese controlled the Philippines for 3 years, the Filipinos remained faithful to the Americans despite starvation, brutality, and murder at the hands of the Japanese. Manuel led a country surrounded by internal crisis as president of the Commonwealth. World War II demonstrated the ability of leaders to lead a government in the midst of conflict, and demonstrated the Filipino people's courage and capacity to defend themselves against foreign threat. Problems of the Commonwealth. Prior to giving independence, there was a transitional administration known as Commonwealth. The issues it had to deal with related to national security, social stability, and economic independence. But despite that problems, Quezon took on these issues head-on and with optimism. National security. When World War II broke out, the United States was not ready to defend the Philippines as their colony. Some Americans believed that the country would be difficult to defend, although they were hesitant to join the conflict. Japan's aggressive expansionist plans for the country would certainly include the invasion of the Philippines, and the United States would be unable to stop it. For instance, President Franklin D. Roosevelt thought that in order to prevent the war with Japan, the United States should grant the Philippines independence. At the time, Japan was a rising power that had won wars against both China and Russia. Japan attacked Korea, Manchuria, and eventually China in the years that followed. This desire of extending Japan was what Quezon concerned about. The National Defense Law, which provided a citizen army made of trainees who belonged to the 21-year-old group, was the first law he proposed the National Assembly. General Douglas MacArthur was selected as the Philippine Army's field marshal to carry out the law. The so-called Mosquito Fleet was an idea MacArthur had because there wasn't enough money to pay for the expensive construction of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. It is small, fast, and heavily armed boats made up of this group. Filipino pilots received air combat training and they were fully prepared for the conflict. The second one is social problems. Quezon's agrarian issues during the Commonwealth era can be connected to the Spanish era. The few powerful residents had taken advantage of the majority of Filipinos, especially the peasants, regarding the fire state's issues. The masses labored day after day in conditions of poverty and ignorance with no prospect of salvation. As shown in the multiple agrarian revolutions under Spanish rule, the desperate situations of the people led many to stand in protest. In 1930s, the so-called Colorums took up arms against the authorities in Mindanao to show their displeasure over existing conditions. In 1920s and 1930s, peasants protested in central and southern Luzon as well as the Visayas. In particular, the oppression of some landowners was the turning point for the uprising in Tayog, Pangasinan in 1931. The Sakdal uprising in 1935, however, provided a clear evidence of social discontent. The Sakdal organization was started by Tagalog poet Benigno R. Ramos and it allied with the peasants. It started government graft and corruption. It battled against Tiding McDuffie Act because it wanted immediate independence. The Sakdalista or members of Sakdal organization went up in protest against the government on May 23, 1935. The revolt was to put down by the government and those who took part in it were punished. Then Ramos escaped to Japan. During this time, socialism and communism gained popularity among the lower classes, including laborers and farmers. Quezon tried to create law to enhance the welfare of rural population, but the government lacked the funds to buy land estates. These social justice laws were opposed by Quezon's inner circle of friends and supporters as well as the large and influential landowners. Quezon's social justice therefore ultimately failed. Economic problems. Since the time of the Spanish occupation, the Chinese had dominated the nation's retail trade sector, which diverted Quezon's focus to other economic issues. The Americans, Chinese, and Japanese, on the other hand, controlled foreign trade in the Philippines. Philippine products entered American markets duty-free when free trade between the United States and the Philippines started in 1909. Through the ports of Manila, Mindanao, and southern Luzon, foreign trade was made possible. The nation's communication and transportation system was improved by Quezon. The railway lines were expanded and improved, and inter-island shipping was developed. The availability of transportation and communication with very cheap prices was made possible by the huge expansion in the number of vehicles. To improve connectivity between the nation's major cities and towns, airfields were built. In Manila, radio broadcasting began and telephone and wireless services were improved. On Quezon's advice, the National Assembly established the National Economic Council, whose main responsibility was to advise the government on economic matters. The National Development Company was reformed in accordance with this policy to increase its effectiveness and responsiveness to public needs. It also established government corporations with the primary responsibilities of protecting the people from exploitation by corrupt producers and traders, such as the National Food Products Corporation, the National Rice and Corn Corporation, and others. Priority was placed on public welfare as the government strengthened organizations to enhance and broaden the scope of service provided to the public, particularly the poor. As previously mentioned, women were granted the right to vote in 1935. Though contests and literary and artistic competitions, the government promoted the arts and literature. Quezon founded the Commonwealth Literary Contest in Tagalog, English, and Spanish in 1939, and the Suggestions of Philippine Writers League. These competitions inspired many creative writers in all three languages and promoted literary activities. The War in the Pacific. When war broke out in the Pacific in 1941, the Commonwealth plans for an independent Philippines were stopped. Political leaders in the Philippines, particularly Claro M. Recto, feared that Japan posed a threat to the country's security, and their fears were confirmed. Japanese bombers attacked at the American fleet in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on December 7, 1941, at Hawaiian time. President Franklin D. Roosevelt urged the American Congress to declare war on Japan in his speech to joint session of Congress following the attack. The Congress immediately declared war on Japan. On December 8, British time, England was declared war against Japan, and the war in Pacific was on. The occupation of Manila. In an effort to attack the United States, Britain, and Holland, the Japanese Navy, Army, and Air Force went on the attack. The Philippines, Malaya, and Indonesia, three of its territories in Asia, were targeted. The Japanese bombed numerous locations on December 8 and the following days, including Manila and its surroundings. Douglas MacArthur declared Manila an open city in order to prevent its destruction. Manila was removed all any weapons and other defenses. However, the Japanese ignored the open city declaration. They kept bombing it, destroying homes and other structures in the meantime. Japanese troops also attacked on northern and southern Luzon during this time. On January 2, the Japanese forces arrived and took control of Manila after both armies managed to break the Filipino-American defenses. Fall of Bataan and Corregidor. When the conflict started, Quezon was terribly ill. When he discovered that Japanese bombing in Bataan and other locations had caused thousands of Filipinos death, his sickness worsened. MacArthur advised Quezon, his family, together with Vice President Osmeña and his family, as well as others, to travel to Corregidor in order to protect him. Quezon started his second term as President of the Commonwealth on December 30 by taking oath of office in Corregidor. Bataan and Corregidor, commanded by General MacArthur, started to suffer severe enemy attacks once the Japanese took control of Manila and other areas of Luzon. The help that MacArthur and the Filipinos expected from the U.S. didn't happen. The lack of food in Bataan caused Filipino and American soldiers to suffer from sickness and starvation. President Roosevelt ordered to move Quezon to Australia after realizing that Bataan would soon fall. He also gave MacArthur the order to go to Australia in March, from which he would command military operations against Japan. The American commander in Bataan submitted on April 9, 1942, despite suffering not only starvation and illness, but also enemy bombs and gunfire. Many American and Filipino prisoners of war were killed while being taken to Capas Tarlac. The Death March was the name given to the terrible incident. Now that Corregidor was the target of their entire attack, the Japanese were free to do so. General Jonathan Wainwright gave the Philippines over to the Japanese on May 6 after this tiny island suffered from the enemy constant daily bombing attacks. Government reorganization. General Masaharu Hama, the Japanese commander-in-chief, ordered the central government to be reorganized shortly after the Japanese forces invaded Manila. This was renamed Central Administrative Organization and is now made out of 6 executive departments: Interior, Finance, Justice, Agricultural and Commerce, Education, Health and Public Welfare, and Public Works and Communications. Japanese advisors were placed in each department. The advisors were actually spies and military agents for Japan. The Japanese military authorities had to give their approval for all appointments to department head positions. However, there were no changes at provincial or municipal levels.
Educational policy of the Japanese. The educational policy of the Japanese is based on the following. First is the spiritual rejuvenation of the Filipinos, especially after all the spiritual experiences they had under previous colonizers. Next is the propagation of the Filipino culture as well as the Japanese language and culture. Even simple roadsides by this time were written in Japanese. Another is the encouragement of vocational and elementary education and the promotion of love and labor. Challenges faced in the implementation. Despite these objectives of the Japanese, challenges were still faced in the educational policies implementation. The enrollment did not exceed to 300,000 all throughout the country, and the uncertainty of war conditions, especially that the Philippines were just stolen by Japan from America. Nonetheless, the promotion of the Japanese educational policy led to the opening of schools with available courses in agriculture, fisheries, medicine, and engineering. The Second Republic. To give Filipinos independence, the Second Republic was established. A commission to frame a constitution was created that was headed by Jose P. Laurel as the head. There were significant other events that happened in the Second Republic. These include the approval of the convention on September 4, 1943, the election of Jose P. Laurel as the president of the Second Republic in September 25. And the day of his inauguration on October 14, in his speech, he said, "I am sure our people will rise as one to meet to the challenges. We shall encounter difficulties greater than we have ever faced in our national history." Guerrilla warfare. Moving on, the Filipinos, despite the offers and services of the Japanese colonizers, disliked them. There were anti-Japanese, and this led them to form guerrilla organization in which patriotic Filipinos joined. They harassed Japanese army units. Reports were sent to General MacArthur, who was in Australia. Here are some of the famous guerrilla leaders: Governor Tomas Confessor from Iloilo, Colonel Macario Pirella from Panay, Colonel Roberto Canglion from Leyte, and so on and so forth. The government and exile. Now in February 1942, Quezon and his party left Corregidor. In the U.S., Quezon recognized Commonwealth government. This is now the start of the establishment of Commonwealth, which had the cabinet members in the name of General Basilio Valdez, the Secretary of National Defense, Manuel Nieto, the Secretary of Agriculture and Commerce, Joaquin Elizalde, the President Commissioner, Dr. Astro Birotor, Executive Secretary, and Jaime Hernandez, the Secretary of Finance. The return of MacArthur. In 1944, 2 years later, the U.S. began fighting against Japan. This was when the famous MacArthur had returned in the Philippines. So in October 20, the American air and naval forces bombarded the Japanese positions in Leyte. The next year, on January 9, 1945, MacArthur landed in Lingayen, Pangasinan, as the Japanese military forces had weakened. And on February 3, the army sliced through central Luzon and reached Manila. The Commonwealth re-establishment. Basically, back in October 24, 1944, MacArthur re-established Commonwealth when Leyte was liberated from the Japanese. Then on February 27, 1945, MacArthur turned over the government to President Osmeña. And on July 4, 1945, the Philippines was proclaimed free from Japan. The end of the war. What followed is the end of the war. America dropped atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Japanese were very threatened, and so on September 2, Japan signed the terms to surrender. The war in the Pacific was finally over.
So that's all, everybody. Thank you for taking your time. Have a great day.